Hi, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. We appreciate it. Tim Andersen here, the Appraiser's Advocate, and we are here with Mr. Craig Morley, the famous Mr. Craig Morley. Now, and he waves acknowledging his fame. Now, we do have to give you a bit of a disclaimer. Craig is here this morning as Craig. He is not here as a member of the Appraisal Standards Board, which he is. But it's just Craig and I talking about various appraisal topics. Now, that said, Craig, how are you this morning?
I'm doing very well, Tim. Thank you.
Craig, I am glad to hear it. I know you've been having some you've been traveling a little bit lately, and that's difficult in these times, and it's not overly pleasant anymore. It's not the fun it used to be. So, and I know your schedule, and I don't envy it at all. Um, Craig, you and I had spoken before off the air relative to various topics. And one of the topics that you're finding is becoming quite important is highest and best use, but not in the traditional highest and best use. Rather, instead of the highest and best use of the real estate, you've been thinking a lot lately about the highest and best use of the appraiser. Now, what brought that on? Why is this becoming so important?
Well, I think, and again, I am not speaking for the Appraisal Foundation, but as there were proposals with the exposure draft that talks a little bit about some possible changes with the certification and the inspection and all of the issues associated with that, it begins to bring up the question, and we start getting a lot of feedback that suggests that sometimes, as appraisers, we feel like that we have to be responsible or involved, I guess, in every element of the appraisal, from picking up the phone to take the initial appraisal order to pushing the send button to deliver the completed report to the client. And it seems over the years, we found that highest and best use, especially on residential properties, tends to be an area where there is deficiencies. And so as I thought a little bit about this concept of highest and best use and looked at it as it applies to human resources, it dawned on me that perhaps this whole concept of highest and best use has a much broader application in human resources as well as in our real property or other types of property that we may be involved with valuation services.
Craig, in speaking of human resources, we both know, in fact, probably everybody watching knows that the concept of the bifurcated appraisal is not only here, but number one, it's not going away. And number two is likely the future of residential real estate appraisal, at least in the GSE space. Now, from that standpoint, have you found any apps or any specific programs that will let the appraiser leverage his or her time in order to make sure that the highest and best use of the appraiser is indeed taking place?
That's a great question, Tim. I think the reality is there is far more technology out there than what most of us are aware of, and certainly more than what is currently being applied or used by many appraisers. Even from the simple application of using management tools that will go and aggregate public record data and MLS data and assemble it all into one place and automatically import that information into my report and generate some useful trend analysis graphs, to mobile tools that will assist me in being able to speed up the process of collecting the property data when I'm out, making my property observations, to some of the more significant tools as apps that will assist, if not completely, measure the home for you. And so as we start looking at some of the technology that is available, there is some remarkable stuff out there that it is going to be probably more mainstream in the next few years. I think I may have shared with you a little app I found on my iPhone where I could walk around and video a property, send the video up through this app, and they would send back a complete floor plan of the property, including the square footage calculations based on the interior observation. And so I've tried several experiments just to see how reliable this is. And it's not perfect. I'm not sure that it's completely ready for mainstream, but we had a couple of trainees in my office. I had done the initial data collection on my office, which has a few weird angles to it. And I was curious to see how well it would work. It came back with something, the exhibit was amazing. I mean, if I'm trying to lease commercial space or market commercial space, it's fantastic. But it looked like it might be a little off on the square footage calculations. Well, we had a couple of trainees in getting some training from out of state, and we had them go around with their lasers and iPads, and one trainee was 20 square feet smaller than what the application had shown. The other one was about 20 square feet larger based on their rounding differences on how they were, collecting their measurements and applying them. And so we came back thinking, this is not too bad. And so I think that we have good tools out there, and I think we're going to see better tools as some of the technology continues to evolve.
Okay, Craig, thank you. So even though some of these apps, some of this equipment might be in the, let's call it the beta testing stage, we're going to see it relatively quickly. So therefore, given the GSE's emphasis on keeping the appraiser appraising rather than doing, taking pictures and slapping tapes on houses and hand delivering reports, the technology exists and is being developed that is going to leverage the appraiser's time. Now, let me ask an ancillary question on that. If the appraiser is going to have the ability to leverage his or her time, thus not have to do some of the, for lack of a better term, administrative work, how is that going to affect the business structure of a lot of appraisal businesses? In other words, they're set up such that, if somebody throws a file on the appraiser's desk and says, go appraise it. And the appraiser has to do everything from, as you said, basically take the first phone call until you hit the send button, sending the appraisal off to the client. So do you think that the ability to leverage technology, leverage equipment is going to necessitate a change in the typical appraiser's business structure?
I think that in order to completely leverage and really be as efficient as a person ought to be, that you pretty much have to start taking a look at how I have my business set up. Many of the residential appraisal firms around businesses around the country are one-man shops, and they're working out of their home. And there's nothing wrong with that model, but it may not be the most efficient model for maximizing the productivity of the appraiser. So for example, when I first started back in the 80s, it was a different world. I mean, you didn't have cell phones. You were typing stuff on typewriters. You didn't, I had a conversation with one of my buddies who is a executive officer for a local MLS. And he was telling me when they stopped printing the multiple listing book and put it online, he had a half a dozen agents that just threw up their hands in despair and quit because they had destroyed their ability to make a living because they didn't have their MLS book they could carry around with them to look at property. And we had appraisers during that same time period that would go print off the MLS sheets and create their own books because they had become so accustomed to using that printed sheet as an MLS book, which, by the way, was really hard to search for stuff very efficiently if you had any volume of data. And now you look back at it and think, how on earth would I ever deal with collecting information without having some of the search tools that we currently have? So there's no question that we resist change. It's a little bit painful, but the reality is that if I, as an appraiser, can bill out, and I'm just going to throw numbers out for illustrative purposes, but if my time is worth $100 an hour doing appraisal work, and I'm answering the phone and I'm setting up the files and I'm collecting the data, how much would it cost me to hire someone to do that stuff for me? And if I can get that done for $15 or $20 an hour, and it saves me an hour or two on an appraisal, is not my time better spent doing the $100 an hour task rather than doing the $20 an hour task? And so as we look at the highest and best use of us as appraisers, the question is, what's legally permissible? What can I legally do and what can't I do under the appraisal standards and under the state rules that govern the license that has been given to us to operate in the respective states that we work in? And that becomes really the first thing is, what can I hire somebody to do? I may not be able to have them do everything, but I can certainly have them do something.
So from a standpoint of a business model, let's suppose, Craig, that someone came to you and obviously an experienced appraiser, someone you knew who had basic competency, and came to you and said, Craig, I'm thinking about setting up my own appraisal business. And I'm looking at what kind of business model I should set up. Given that question in the context of what we've been talking about, what answer, what advice, what counsel would you give?
Well, much of this becomes a function of how busy are you? How much work do you have? If I don't have very much work, it may not make sense to hire a bunch of staff to help me if I don't have enough work to justify the added expense and the added overhead associated with hiring staff and personnel to help me. But I think there's a lot of appraisers right now that are going crazy because they've got too much work. And if I find myself in that situation, I think the thing I have to take a look at is, how much more productive would I be by hiring someone to help me with this stuff? And off, there's a training process. You don't hire somebody off the street to come in and start doing this stuff without getting some real learning curve on the front end of this stuff. And oftentimes what we find is that it might be a situation where we associate or collaborate with another appraiser that we have an association with and say, why don't we cost share? I don't have enough to keep a staff person busy full time, but maybe together we would. And so we start looking at ways to leverage the assistance from some third, somebody else that can help with answering the phone calls, collecting the public record data, handling the billing, uploading the reports. I find for me, I have to have somebody read my report before it goes out, because I've got this real problem where what I've typed is not what I think I typed. I in my mind, I know what I wanted to say, but my fingers kind of have a mind of their own. And so having some third party that goes and reads this stuff and says, this doesn't make sense. What were you trying to say? And it's usually because I was interrupted with something. And so having that assistance is such a benefit. It cuts down on the number of revision requests, and you don't look quite as foolish when if somebody else can read it and make sense out of it, it probably means that I'm going to eliminate the a future callback. And I don't know about you, but I've got enough ego that I would just as soon not get that callback and have it read reasonably well than to look like an idiot when you send something out in a hurry.
One reason I retired from appraising. Craig, you opened the door to training. So let's cover that issue. Okay, let's go back to your $100 an hour example. You can bill $100 an hour, and therefore you're going to farm out the $15 and $20 an hour work to somebody else, be it an employee or a virtual assistant. Now, from a standpoint of training new appraisers, are we going to see new business practices? Are we going to see a new business model? Are we going to see basic appraisal education feature learning how to use some of these apps? Or is the training of the new appraiser going to continue on with the tried, true, but incredibly inefficient training model that we have now?
Right now, under the current model that we have, it really becomes a perpetuation of whatever our trainer does is kind of what gets passed on. It's almost a generational kind of a training model. And so if I've got a very competent, cutting edge trainer who is aware of many of the technologies and trying to figure out what works and what doesn't, then we will have well-trained trainees. But if I've got someone who is old like me and is resistant to change and isn't aware of what's going on, we really probably are not going to have the kind of cutting edge ability to get people where they need to be to embrace some of these tools that I think will not only make us more efficient, but produce better assignment results as a result of having some of the technical tools that so frequently aren't being used by many of the appraisers who are so busy doing their day-to-day stuff that they don't take the time to step back and see, are there tools out there? How do they work? And am I willing to invest the upfront time that it takes to incorporate some of these things? And with training staff, that is absolutely the case. Now, in our case, in my case, we have 8 appraisers working in our office, and it's a more or less a job share kind of a thing. I mean, we make a little money as a business owner, but what it really does is it's a lifestyle choice for me, because I can leave the office and I don't worry about things getting done. I don't generate the invoices. I don't collect the money. I don't make the deposits. I don't upload the appraisals. I don't set the appraisals up. I consult with staff when they have questions. And I can tell you, Tim, I mean, I have made more money by letting my staff go out and bid these things, because they tend to be a little more, they'll come in and bid these things higher than I probably would have. And they're pretty good at collecting the money. I mean, they'll go in and say, if you want the report, send me a check. And we've developed some ways, we're doing credit cards over the phone and all that, but we've got now to where we're using a QuickBooks link where we can send them a link. They can do that and the money automatically gets deposited in the account. And I mean, there's some pretty neat ways to improve just the day-to-day business operations that my life is way easier than it used to be. We have almost no bad debt collection. And it has just become a far more efficient model for us doing business, to where I've got people and that are trained. And if we hire a new staff member, because we've got we've got 4 full-time employees working, so our ratio is about 1 full-time employee to 2 appraisers is kind of the ratio that we see. And our overhead runs, and we've seen several studies done where by the time you take into consideration the cost of your MLS, your E&O, your continuing education, all of the other things that are associated with doing an appraisal, it's about 30%. And so, I always kind of chuckle when I hear somebody talking about, I thinking that what I bill, my gross billing, is my net income. It's just not. There's cost associated with that. And if I can leverage myself so that I'm doing $100 an hour work and I can up my gross billing, my net income essentially is going to go up, even though my expenses go up. And so I think as we start looking at, the appraiser from a highest and best use perspective, when I look at, there's a lot of things that I can allow somebody else to do that's legally permissible. Now, we do run into problems where people go cross the line, where we've seen people who are doing an FHA appraisal that requires the FHA panel appraiser to inspect the property, and they go get somebody else to go do it. And then they essentially lie on the certification. They sign saying, hey, I made a personal inspection on this property, when in fact they did not. That's a problem. That's one of those things that is not a legally permissible activity that the appraiser can participate in. But as long as I'm having a relationship with my client, and I know what they will let me do and what I can't do, and what the state will let me do and what I can't do, then I can have somebody else do these other things. And as I look at what's physically possible, instead of, let's say, I'm doing, I don't know, 10 assignments a week. I'm working hard. I'm getting 10 appraisals a week done. And I am now leveraging myself. What's physically possible, the second element of highest and best use is what's physically possible. Well, I've now gone from doing 10 appraisals a week to doing 15. And as long as my cost in performing or those additional tasks doesn't exceed the extra 5 appraisals that I've done, then I have now met the third element of highest and best use of financial feasibility. What's financially feasible? As long as hiring my help doesn't cost me more than what I'm generating in income, that's financially feasible. And at some point, as we look at the fourth element, what is the productive use, the most productive use? It's the one that gets me the most money in my pocket. Because, realistically, gross income is nice, but if my gross income increases and my net income decreases, then that's probably not the maximally productive use. But I think, we found, having experimented with a number of models, that anytime we can get somebody doing a $20 an hour job that I don't have to do, if I'm billing $100 an hour, is going to result in a more productive use than me doing the tasks that I could hire someone else to do. The challenge you've got is you're going to have to invest some money at the front end and some time in the front end in getting them trained so that they do it the way you want them to do it. And once you do that, life starts to get a little better for you.
All right, let's carry on with that thought of money and training. Now, quite a bit about PREA, practical application of real estate appraisal. we're both involved with it at the very front end of it. So we have an idea about what's going on. We have an idea about where it's going. We don't know exactly where it's going, but we've got a pretty good idea of where it's going. Now, as you're talking about $100 an hour, $20 an hour, as you're talking about training, as you're talking about leveraging time, do you think that that PREA, assuming it gets put together as it has generally been envisioned, do you think that PREA is going to allow the $100 an hour appraiser to leverage his or her time in training the 25 or $30 an hour appraiser, or is the $100 an hour appraiser just going to have to sit back and eat it and say, well, I'm going to take one for the team and train future appraisers, and there'll be a very pleasant, breezy spot in heaven for me because I've done that. What do you think is going on there?
Well, PREA, the concept of PREA, I think, is pretty good. Having witnessed appraisers selecting, a supervising appraiser and discovering that the supervising appraiser is not fully, dare I say, competent to train their trainee, the model that we have kind of perpetuates whatever your trainer does. And if your trainer is not fully up to speed on what they ought to be doing, it really almost creates a situation where we perpetuate incompetence over a long period of time, and that is not really in the best interest for the profession. PREA still has some real questions. I mean, we don't know how well this is going to work, but I think what it's probably going to do is that even if it has limitations, it might be better for some people than getting a poor trainer. And my son Jeff is on the Utah Appraiser Licensing and Certification Board, and they will have people who will submit their applications and have their experience denied because of deficiencies in the work. And these people oftentimes will come in indignant saying, how dare you say my work is not up to speed? And then they will sit through the process and realize that, I didn't realize I needed to do this. Or they're not filling out their, experience logs properly, and all these kinds of things that can be a problem when it comes time to submitting your application for approval. So that at some point, this will help to solve some of those problems. And I think in a perfect world, and not every state has the licensed appraiser, but in a perfect world, from my personal perspective, having PREA get someone to a licensed state so that they can act as an appraiser, and then allow them to get real world practical experience from the license to the certification, in my view, at least at this point, seems to be the most reasonable way to approach that. However, many states don't adopt that licensing step along the way. And so, it'll be interesting to see where it goes. I hope that most states will allow PREA to at least get them to where the appraiser is fully licensed or certified in one way or another, because otherwise it's not going to be very practical. But I think it will open some doors for some of these folks who would like to get into the profession and can't find a trainer. And so it'll be interesting to see where it goes. But I think that it's certainly going to allow access into the profession that hasn't been there before, assuming that the cost isn't prohibitive.
Okay, Craig, you hinted at the concept of appraisal regulation when you mentioned that appraisers were coming up before the board and the board was denying their application. So I put this question to you, not in your capacity as an ASB member, but in your capacity as a former member of the Utah board and a consultant to the Utah board. And Jeff's father, but we won't go there. Now, what do you think the effects are or will be if indeed the bifurcated appraisal model comes to the fore, as it most likely will, on appraisal regulation? Is that going to have to change in any way? Is appraisal regulation well into the 21st century? Or are we still operating with state statutes that just assume a 20th century appraisal business model and an appraisal practice?
Well, my experience is that regulators tend to not be on the cutting edge with this stuff. So the reality is, and I'm told that there are some complaints that have been filed on appraisers who used property data that was collected by a third party. And so it's going to be interesting to see how the regulators deal with that kind of an issue. A property owner gets an appraisal back. The appraiser did not inspect the property. He was using data that was provided to them by a third party. The property owner is now unhappy with the results, and they're claiming that there's some deficiencies in the information that was used in the appraisal. What is the regulator going to do with that? And you know, as appraisers, you know, it's a little bit of a tricky situation. I was with NAR when we were developing some standards for this third-party data collection model that is going to become part of the process. This is a kind of a swerve off to the side, but for the longest time, I could not figure out why the GSEs were so interested in having this third-party inspection model become kind of something that they were interested in. It didn't make sense to me. And in speaking with some of them, I began to understand where they're coming from, and it starts to make a little bit more sense when you understand what the problem is. And the problem has been their analysis is that there is confirmation bias by appraisers who are trying to make a property owner happy. And so the idea is, and this has happened to me, you go in, you find some nice people that are in difficult circumstances that are trying to get, if I can just get this appraisal at this amount of money, you know, I can pay for my son's medical expenses and solve all these problems. And you come away thinking, wow, these guys are in tough shape. I'd really like to be able to help their situation. How much does that influence the assignment result? You know, am I pushing harder than I should to get a result that's going to help these people out with the allegations of racial discrimination? You know, will having some third party who's out collecting the data that is different than the person who's doing the appraisal, you know, developing the results, does that help mitigate some of those possible claims of bias? And so with all of the multitude of various biases that can exist, will having someone collecting the data solve some of those problems? And we don't know, but yeah, the answer is probably it will, at least in some degree, provided that you've got a competent person that is, or the information that's being relied on by the appraiser is as accurate and good. And that's where we start running into the problem, is that if I've got the Uber driver who's pulling up front and running through the house, taking a few photos, and the property owner says, hey, dude, let me tell you what, I'll give you $50 if you don't take a picture of the hole in the wall and the settlement in the foundation. This guy's got no code of ethics. He's not licensed. Why not? And now I've got some poor appraiser who's using information that is tainted. It's not accurate. It doesn't give the full picture. And now the prospective buyer who's, you know, made this purchase this property where the information is incomplete, filing a complaint with the division, and now I'm getting drugged before the state to defend this appraisal. Well, the question is did I have a reason to believe that the information provided to me was accurate? And if the answer is yes, then I'm probably okay. If I found discrepancies and I said, I just can't develop a credible assignment result without looking at this property. There's some inconsistencies that I need to resolve, and I don't even know who the person is that collected the data, might be a bigger problem. I might have a problem because I had a reason to question the information provided, and I proceeded anyway. That might be a problem. So it's new ground. I think the regulators are going to have some challenges trying to figure out how to deal with it. And I know for a fact appraisers are pretty leery about using some of this data, especially when that information is being provided by a client. And I don't know who it is that collected the data, their qualifications. I think those kinds of scenarios become a bigger problem than my employee that I sent out, or a qualified third party, or some app where I've got a 360-degree view of the property with notes made for issues with smell or deficiencies or other things that make it almost as good as me being there. It may end up being, I think there are ways to do this that will offset or mitigate many of the concerns that people have. But simply because there are possibilities of being able to do it doesn't mean that that third party method is going to be the best situation every time. It may not work in every assignment.
All right, okay, with that reasonable doubt out there, let me raise one more question. You mentioned the fact that the borrower is upset about something. So the borrower files a complaint against the appraiser. Now, we both know that the agreement with the appraiser is between the appraiser and the bank. The borrower's got nothing to do with it. The borrower's not a client. Borrower is not an intended user. Borrower, from a standpoint of the appraiser, is nothing. Just another human being who obviously deserves respect and courtesy, but that's it. Now, the appraiser is minding his or her own business, and 3 months later gets a letter from the state appraisal board saying, hello, the borrower has filed a complaint against you because he or she thinks you're an icky person. Now, really, the borrower had nothing to do with it. The borrower wasn't the client. The borrower hasn't been hurt. You haven't done anything to hurt the borrower. Really, does the borrower have any standing to file a complaint? Or is that just part of the silliness of the business that we have to put up for, and we have to put up with and budget for?
Well, it is part of the silliness, I'm afraid. I mean, most of the time, and I think most state regulators recognize that if a borrower had a preconceived idea of what the property was worth, and more often than not, the borrower files the complaint when the value isn't what they hoped it would be, and the state will oftentimes take kind of a jaundiced view of that whole thing, saying, well, if the appraisal was well done, and a lot of these complaints get filtered out, and as appraiser, you may never even hear about it. But the problem that I think oftentimes as appraisers we forget, and this is part of the regulatory requirement under Dodd-Frank, is that once a complaint gets submitted, if they open up an investigation on it, you may discover that the issue that they have isn't the deficiency that you've got in your appraisal. So they'll come in and look at this and say, the complaint that the value's too low is not the problem. The problem is this is a residential home in a commercial zone, and you didn't do an appropriate highest and best use analysis. And by the way, we found some discrepancies in your data that looks to be wrong. And oftentimes the stuff I see happen is that I cloned an old report where I said property values are stable and everything's just, even Steven, when in fact property values are going up at ridiculously rapid rates, and my report is not appropriately showing that. And oh, by the way, I may not have made appropriate market condition adjustments, or I have inconsistencies within the body of my appraisal. So your value might be okay, but I've got other problems that then are the issues that end up giving me grief, because I didn't do things the way that I should have. And so, obviously the solution to that problem is to have a really good work file and make sure that I'm doing a really good job in writing my reports. And as I had kind of alluded to before, having somebody else look at your stuff really kind of helps solve some of those problems. And so if I'm trying to do everything by myself and I'm under pressure and I hurry and upload the report without doing a thorough review of it before it goes out, guarantee that's going to be the one that ends up before the regulatory board. And you're going to find out that, crap, I had a couple of problems, and it's going to cost me quite a bit more than what I got on the fee.
As you said, silliness. Okay, Craig, thank you. I appreciate your time, your expertise, and above all, your candor. Thank you very much. Is there anything else on your mind that we need to talk about?
We don't have time for that. No, it's always a pleasure to visit, Tim. I think this idea, as we start looking to the future, and how, as appraisers, do we evolve to stay relevant in the profession? I think ultimately the thing that we have to do is we have to do a highest and best use analysis on ourselves. We have to look and say, am I acting in a way that is, that is legal? The stuff I'm doing, can I actually do this without violating my standards? Am I working in a way that is going to give me the best net result? And we might have to rethink how we're doing things. And we might have to spend a Saturday embracing, go onto YouTube and figure out how to use some kind of some of these additional tools, whether it's going mobile or whether it's learning how to use some of these other analytical tools that are out there, so that at the end of the day, am I producing work that will stand up to scrutiny? And if I'm doing that, I believe there's always going to be room for competent, well-qualified appraisers. We just have to make sure that we are those who fit that description. And if we do that, there's always going to be work to do. We get all kinds of assignments coming in that are not lender related, that oftentimes pay better. And I'm not dealing with some, third party high school graduate that is asking me, some crazy question that has nothing to do with the assignment, but is on a checkoff list. And so I think as we look at making ourselves and keeping ourselves relevant in the profession, there's going to be room for those who want to get in. We just need to make sure that we're not, that we're producing value in terms of the work product that we're producing.
Craig, thank you. I appreciate it. I look forward to the next time we chat. So we've been at this for about 45 minutes. And I think that we've covered some fascinating areas and given some appraisers, especially some new appraisers, a great deal to think about. So Craig, until the next time we chat, which I hope is soon, please let me express my best to you and your family. Thanks. We'll be in touch. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Best to you, Tim.